The first book we'll be talking about is My Antonia. It was written by Willa Cather and it was published in 1918. The genre is fiction and has been adapted into a movie television in 1994. The novel centers around two characters, Antonia Shimerda, an immigrant girl, and Jim Burton, the narrator. He moved from Virginia to Nebraska to live with his grandparents. Both Jim and Antonia grew up together in Nebraska. Antonia and her family moved from Bohemia in Europe to Nebraska in the United States. The typical gender norms in the early 1900s when the book was published was that women stayed home and cooked for their families and they took care of the children. Men, on the other hand, had the exclusive right to work on the farms and make money for the family. But in My Antonia, these gender roles completely swapped. One of the main reasons for this gender swap in My Antonia was due to the passing of Mr. Shimerda. Ambrose Shimerda would not have been able to fill this void all by himself, so this gave the unique opportunity to the women in the family, like Mrs. Shimerda and Antonia, to step up and start working on the farm and making money to fill the void. So, Antonia did just that. She started working on the farm to help support the family by making food and money. This is one of the primary steps in the reversal of gender roles, as prior to this, women worked exclusively in the house and they rarely were allowed to do physical work on the farm. One such description of Antonia on the farm can be seen through Jim's description of her on page 82. He describes her as, "She kept her sleeves rolled up all day, and her arms and throat were burned as brown as the sailors. Her neck came up strongly out of her shoulders, like the bole of a tree out of the turf. One sees that draught horse neck among the peasant women in all old countries. She had come to us a child, and now she was a tall, young girl." This quote helps to show that Antonia was no longer the innocent girl at the start of the novel. She is now more brawny and masculine, working to cement the idea of the swap of the gender roles occurring in the novel. Another aspect of the swap in gender roles can be seen when immigrant women like Antonia moved to Black Hawk to make money and support their families back on the farm. Before, such duties relating to money and supporting the family were usually given to men, not the women. Often, these immigrant women faced discrimination from the townspeople and they were labeled with the derogatory term hired girls. This could be seen on the quote found on page 132. "All foreigners were ignorant people who couldn't speak English. People saw no difference between her, Antonia, and the three Marys. They were all Bohemians, all hired girls." Immigrant women were also viewed in two different ways in the novel. One was as promiscuous. Often, in attempts to relax when in town, immigrant girls like Antonia, Tiny, and Lena attended night dances. They are depicted as flirtatious and irresponsible when it came to dancing with the boys in the town. This creates the idea that all immigrant girls are careless. Secondly, they are viewed as defiant. Due to the dances, Antonia became more irresponsible and careless with the housework at the Harling family. When she is given an ultimatum to either stop going to the dances or to stay with the family, she decides to leave the house to live with the Cutters. This creates the idea that all immigrant girls are defiant. This swap in gender roles in My Antonia also connects to the time period in which it was published. During the early 1900s, many immigrants were moving to America. There, they faced many hardships when acclimating to the new environment and culture. Women often had to assume larger roles to support their family. Women started making important family decisions, made money, and worked on the farm. This change in family dynamics sounds very, very familiar to another novel we have read, The Grapes of Wrath. Rachel will get into this next. Lastly, it is important to note that My Antonia is one of the few novels we have read to be written by a woman, Willa Cather. Her straightforward and frank depiction of women serves as a symbol of women's strength and determination during that time period.
And now on to The Grapes of Wrath, written by John Steinbeck and published in 1939. Some of the awards it has won is the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Award, and Steinbeck won the Nobel Prize in 1969. The Grapes of Wrath explores a period in time in which the Americans began to travel from Oklahoma to California due to the drastic effects of the Dust Bowl. They had been driven from their homes when the effects of drought, economic hardship, and land foreclosure had become too hard to bear. The so-called Okies, from Oklahoma, traveled in search for financial support, a home, and stability for their future. Meet the Joads. Along the way, we learn about the struggles of the Joad family, and through their journey, their relationships form and break as life becomes harder and necessities become scarce. Steinbeck touches many different themes in the novel, such as the large idea of religion, wealth, and social and family hierarchy. But what we really want to explore is his interpretation of women in the novel. In the beginning, women were given weaker roles in society, not being able to make impactful decisions and only really being there to support the family by cooking and cleaning. If we take a closer look at it, an important scene in the novel is on page 100, when the family was standing around a broken truck, and the oldest men were the closest to it, followed by younger men, and then women, and the children were the furthest from it. Steinbeck describes it like the truck was the nucleus. The men had the most dominance and control when they began their journey, but as we read further into the story, the men become more restless and frustrated, that they cannot support their family like their intentions had been. We even noticed that most of the men had strayed from the story, whether they had died or just left. Now this is where women really came into play. They took their roles to heart and recognized that they had to become the leaders of the family, and were really the backbone from the beginning. They had always been selfless and put themselves second for the sake of growth and stability. Ma Joad was the strongest figure to display this idea, where, on page 196, Ma defies her husband. "I'll knock you belly up with a bucket, I swear to holy Jesus' sake I will." Pa looked helplessly about the group. They watched Pa, waiting for him to break into fury. They watched his lax hands to see the fists form, and Pa's anger did not rise, and his hands hung limply at his sides. And in a moment, the group knew that Ma had won. This scene is significant because it is the first point that we can pin the moment that Ma's leadership is established, and we have come to the conclusion that the male had lost. However, the progression of women's roles in the book helps us understand Steinbeck's view of women, hinting that he truly believes that women are integral in our society. Looking at it from a historical perspective, having been written in 1939 just following the women's rights movement, Steinbeck introduces a bigger topic to explore. It may point to the ways that Steinbeck feels about women now that the country has gained a new perspective on their roles, even though men at the time were still more dominant. He uproots themes of women and their sacrifices to show that they give up a part of themselves to help others, as seen in the final scene of the novel, where Rose of Sharon breastfeeds an ill man after her own miscarriage. As you can see from the different events in the novel, The Grapes of Wrath, John Steinbeck formulates a stronger opinion on women and how they can become so powerful in times of need, which suggests that he supported the women's rights movement and believes women have a chance to play a bigger role.
Crucible is a play by Arthur Miller written in 1952. The play follows the people of Salem, Massachusetts in 1692. It takes place during the time period of the Salem witch trials, during which women were accused of being witches working for the devil. Many of their actions, even those as simple as dancing or keeping dolls, were seen as sinful and caused the innocent women to suffer extreme consequences. Looking closer at the play reveals that there are two distinct categories of female characters. Every female character can be categorized as innocent and angelic, or sinful like the devil, depending on how they are viewed by the men in power. The supposedly angelic women are seemingly innocent young girls who claim they are being attacked by the conjurings of others. In reality, they are just trying to protect their own reputations and abuse power that they never had before they began making accusations for personal revenge. In this regard, Miller depicts women to be power-hungry and selfish. Another thing to notice is the time period in which the play takes place. The events of The Crucible occur long before any of the other novels we are discussing, with the Salem witch trials taking place in the 1690s. The other texts we are discussing take place in the 19th and 20th centuries. This shows how the double standard of the male and female genders is not a new idea and is actually rooted deep in history. Additionally, looking into the time period during which this play was written sheds some light on Miller's reason for basing his play off of this discrimination. During the 1950s, when the play was written, the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, was prosecuting and incriminating those who were suspected of having communist ties. Countless innocent people were wrongfully blacklisted and faced a variety of other consequences. It is clear that Miller's use of gender discrimination in the play alludes to the unfair treatment of innocent people during the HUAC trials. Now Santiago will be telling you about gender roles in The Great Gatsby.
The fiction and drama novel The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald was published in 1925. It accompanies a group of characters living in the wealthy fictional towns of West and East Egg in Long Island during the summer of 1922. The plot surrounding it follows a man named Jay Gatsby on his quest to achieve massive wealth and influence in an attempt to catch the attention of a girl named Daisy. Throughout the novel, Fitzgerald showed that the men of the novel are expected to make money for the women. He also depicts that the men of the novel are dominant over the women, especially through the character Tom Buchanan. When the narrator of the story, Nick, visits his cousin Daisy and her husband Tom, Nick recognizes that Daisy has no control in the family and acknowledges the family is a Tom Buchanan's. This is even more evident by the fact that Tom Buchanan openly cheats on his wife, Daisy. Despite her knowledge of his affairs, she remains quiet and accepts Tom's behavior. Another example of Tom's superiority over the women in the novel is depicted in a scene where he assaults his mistress Myrtle. Even though Tom leaves her with a broken nose, Tom hides behind his superiority, facing no repercussions whatsoever. Instead, they resume their relationship directly after the event, and Myrtle acts as if nothing happened. Moreover, Daisy is also portrayed as an object, goal, or idea that the character Gatsby has set his life on pursuing, rather than as an individual with a personality. Jay Gatsby looks at her as a trophy or an achievement, and could care less about her as a person. The only exception to the gender role Fitzgerald has set in the novel seems to come with the female character Jordan. She is a professional golf player that makes her own money and supports herself. She is the only female character that actually has a profession, and is not portrayed as being inferior to a man, nor does she depend on or need support from one. However, Jordan then gets in a relationship with Nick. It continues throughout the course of the novel until Nick starts blatantly disregarding her towards the end. Eventually, Jordan makes a phone call to Nick and he abruptly ends the relationship without much thought, leaving her devastated. Even though Fitzgerald seems to depict her as being different from the female cliché he has created, a man ultimately deems her insignificant and casts her aside, as has occurred to all the other female characters. Overall, the recurring theme here is that the author portrays women as having less power and superiority than men. This theme is also directly reflected in the era this novel was written in during the 1920s. Despite the slight shift in attitude shown with the passing of the 19th Amendment in 1920, the American consensus at the time still remained. Women belonged at home with the children, whereas the men belonged taking care of money, business, and politics.